Welcome, everybody. Good to see you. This is the IGRI's monthly research seminar. My name is Uta Brady. I'm a postdoc at Arizona State University and also IGRI's associate director. I'm glad to be here and glad to see all of you, and because I missed a couple of sessions, so I was a little bit sad about that, but glad to be back. And today, we have a special guest, Dan Detzi from the University of Arizona, who's a student of Adela Schlagers and who will be presenting some of his dissertation work. And Dan also was one of the first cohort of IGRI grad students who participated in a workshop along at the same time as we had the IGRI conference in the summer. So I know a little bit about his work, and I'm really excited to see how it's advanced since then. But before we get started and I hand it over to Dan, do we have any updates? Saba, is there anything that, or Davor, anything that, no?
No, nothing. I guess, shortly after the new year, since we probably won't see each other until the next seminar, we'll be posting information about the third IGRI conference, as well as the upcoming doctoral consortium and our annual institutional analysis training. So please keep an eye out for all of that just about the new year time.
Thank you, Saba. Davor, anything?
No,
okay,
not really.
Good. Welcome, Brenda. We're just getting started, so you haven't missed anything. All right, Dan, I will give the floor to you, and we'll talk to you. Looking forward to it.
All right. Thank you, Uta. Let me share my screen here. Okay. So thank you, everyone, for coming and listening to my talk here on what are the initial stages of a dissertation project. So I'm at the very beginning of my dissertation, just got through my prospectus defense in October, late October. So this is obviously a continuation of the research I presented at the workshop this summer, and also the virtual conference. So it's a kind of building on that. And what I'm looking at here is kind of rule types with regard to national security institutions, especially the U.S. institutions. So I'm going to kind of briefly, sorry, I have to get rid of some of these things on the top of my screen here. But I'm going to briefly give you a background of what got me interested in this area of research. I'm kind of a outlier in the world of especially using institutional analysis with regards to national security. So I'm taking a public policy framework and putting it towards a kind of conflict studies, but more importantly, looking at national security. And you can probably tell, for those of you who don't know my background, I'm not your average grad student. I had a career in the military as an Air Force officer, and I also served a few years on the Joint Staff in the Pentagon, which kind of got me interested in some of this decision making, because it is a very complex decision making arena within the U.S. national security construct. But also, I am looking at some of the things throughout our history that made me look at especially counterinsurgencies and counterterrorism decision making, because these are long-term events. These aren't crises, except for being punctuated by some crises. But historically, especially for the U.S., but for other major powers too, counterinsurgencies are not necessarily a shining spot in the record of decision making or conflict for these powers. So you can think of Vietnam, Iraq, definitely Afghanistan, and some of the conflicts with Al Qaeda and ISIS. But particularly what got me interested in looking at this too are the Afghanistan papers that came out in 2019, which were basically a series of interviews with all levels of decision makers throughout the history of the Afghan war. And it started out as a historic look at the Afghanistan war, but then turned into it got released by the Washington Post, but you have a lot of these high profile elite decision makers, military and civilian, discussing how they didn't know what the strategy was. Even these 4-star generals that went into Afghanistan as commanders noted that different groups of whether it's NATO or US forces or non-military forces were doing things that they weren't connected. They weren't connected strategies. So I wanted to look at the actual decision-making mechanisms within the national security construct and see what was going on, kind of opening up the black box, not looking at conflict as a normal IR or comparativist would look at it with big data, looking at sizes of militaries or military spending and relating that to conflict duration and outcome. So I wanted to actually look at the decision-making. And as an IR student, I took Adela's course on public policy, and it just kind of hit all the marks what I was looking at. I said, this is going to fit perfectly. I mean, this fits perfectly with what national security policy and decision-making is like. So I'm fitting some of those aspects into this. I'm looking at these two very significant pieces of decision-making legislation that were put in place to coordinate actions within the defense construct, but haven't really worked. So that's why I'm looking at this. So my overarching research questions for institutional analysis especially is how do institutional rules guide decision-making? You know, so especially looking at rule types within the IAD framework. And I want to look at these long-term decision-making challenges. So counterinsurgencies, you know, those conflicts that go on for 5 to 10, and sometimes, you know, in Afghanistan, 20 years, where decision makers who are at the top of a hierarchical decision-making network, like the National Security Council, which I'll talk about in a minute, don't do day-to-day, month-to-month, and sometimes even, you know, year-to-year decision-making on these like they would on a crisis. I'm coming from civil military relations theory, and I'll talk about that in a second as well, where it's usually a civilian versus military perspectives or preferences. But there's more to that. So I'm looking at how might competing or parallel decision-making networks construct affect conflict processes within these long-term campaigns. Could they create counterproductive strategies, really? So my main argument here is I argued that the nature of decision-making within the US national security construct lends itself to uncoordinated effort in achieving security goals. And I kind of already talk to that, but especially looking at this in this format, conceptualizing national security, this big constellation, as a polycentric arrangement. As I noted, I have this polycentricity definition at the bottom coming from Alajica and Torco. And when I look at this constellation, it's not a hierarchical constellation of decision-making. So I'm also looking at networks, formal networks versus informal networks. So formal networks could be that hierarchical networking I'll talk about in a second, but also informal networks that are kind of semi-autonomous, that don't follow the hierarchical set of guidelines, but are under the same set of rules. Oh. There we go. So as I said, I come from the civ-mil relations theory debate. And in this, they're looking at civilian leaders versus military leaders and their divergent preferences. And these were created, you know, the decision-making arena is created by legislation following World War II is what I'm looking at. And previous literature on civ-mil relations is really not, they discuss how important this legislation is, but they're not breaking into it. They're not delving into it. And just to give some background on this, the National Security Act of 1947 was a response to the uncoordinated efforts during World War II. So even though the United States and the Allies won the war, these institutions and the U.S. national security construct were uncoordinated. They competed. So the Department of the Army and the Department of the Navy were independent or executive departments, much like the Department of State. So they are on the same level as the Department of State and now the Department of Defense. So you could see how competing preferences within those two departments could cause uncoordinated acts. So the National Security Act of 47 was meant to prepare the decision-making construct of the United States for the Cold War and learn from the lessons of World War II of this idea of being uncoordinated actions between the main services, but also between the civilian decision-making construct. Despite this act, between 1947 and 1986, there were many failures within the national security decision-making realm. Vietnam stands out as one of the major wars that were seen as a failure because of disjointed strategies between the war in the north of Vietnam and the war in the south. That's one of those ideas, and also the civilian and military differences in how they wanted to run the war, but organizational differences as well, services competing for resources and strategy during that war. Also, one that stands out is the failed hostage rescue attempt in Iran in 1980, as well as the Beirut bombing of the Marine barracks in 1983. And although it was a successful invasion of Grenada in 1983, it's known, is gone down in the annals of military history as a very discombobulated and debacle, really, of military coordination. So from those failures came this huge reform in 1986, which was meant to streamline decision-making. It was meant to coordinate the actions between military services and also civilian departments. But we still see this uncoordinated action in wars like in the first Gulf War, also the insurgencies in Iraq and Afghanistan. So I look into I'm using the institutional analysis and development framework to look at these decision-making action situations. So I'm considering the national security decision-making apparatus as a polycentric arrangement, as I mentioned. There are semi-autonomous organizations throughout the decision-making arena that are all under the same kind of basic guidelines, but aren't necessarily working in unison, nor are they expected to. And just one caveat to this is, of course, in the military and in the defense decision-making, decentralization of decision-making is beneficial in the sense for innovation, for being able to make decisions quickly. So there is a sense of purpose for having a kind of not a hierarchical decision-making system within the military, or the national security construct. But there are times where this, I think, inhibits, especially in these long-term conflicts, inhibits coming up with coordinated action, coordinated activities. So I'm using this to identify the IAD framework to identify rules in use, and later on, or rules in form versus rules in use, which is formal versus informal, and how that impacts this creation of ad hoc decision-making networks, which I'm going to get to later in my research. So just I know I'm dealing with an audience here who's very familiar with this framework, I believe. So IAD framework. So the action situation construct here is probably very familiar. And this is the image from Ostrom's 2005 book that talks about rule types. So these are the rule types I'm looking at from these two pieces of legislation. And how I'm using IG 2.0 to code the institutional statements from both of these pieces of legislation. And so far, I have about 200 lines of coded institutional statements, just looking at the National Security Council, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the Department of Defense. There's many more in there that I've coded, but this is what I've used just for this initial look at the data. Sorry for the vacuum noise behind me. It's office cleaning time. So I initially look at these three main action situations. I'll tell you kind of how I devised them here. The National Security Council is explicitly the participation. This is explicitly put in the National Security Act of 1947. So these are the positions and Department of Defense and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So the Joint Chiefs of Staff was what I have experience in as just a bureaucratic worker within this. So I kind of have more idea of what goes behind this, but the Joint Chiefs of Staff is comprised of the Chiefs of Staff of all the main or of all the military services, Air Force, Navy, Marines, and Air Force, of course, and now Space Force. This is an example of some of the IG coding statement I've done. So I came across a lot of constitutive statements. And of course, when I read back over this, I say, I could probably switch that up a bit. Maybe that's not quite the, so I do go back and forth to what I identify as the different syntactic elements, but for the most part, this is an example of what I've done. And for the most part, there's one rule per statement. And as you can see, it's very constitutive, constituting the National Security Council and putting the president as presiding over that council. And then this second one here is an example of where there's some embedded lines that would create more than one rule. So using IG extended is IG 2.0 extended is kind of coming into play for me here. And this is kind of some of the examples of how I'm looking at networking this set of statements. So where it's explicitly tying a position in the Joint Chiefs of Staff to the National Security Council. As I go further on, there's other specific ties from one action situation to the other, where there are actually, for example, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff is a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and of the National Security Council. So it goes back and forth and delineates the different actions that the chairman or the other chiefs can take with regard to both of those action situations. So those are the explicit ties I'm looking at. And this is what this is tabular, kind of just initial data that I looked at. On the top, you're going to see the National Security Act of 1947, and the top right, the Goldwater-Nichols Act. So the Act of 47 has 103 total rule types, with the Goldwater-Nichols adding an additional 60 to those. And again, I'm only looking at the NSC, DOD, and JCS, not the other organizations that come from that, which I'll do later, which are the Air Force, Secretary of the Air Force, and all those military elements that come below this, which have a lot more rules to them, especially action. So, and the bottom obviously is the total. So there's 163 total rule types. And here's a little bit of visualization, very rudimentary beginning stages here. But just from this, I can tell a couple things. And I think it's kind of in line with some studies done. I was, just now came across, I don't know why, but Carter et al. In 2016 did a rule type analysis and kind of came to the same conclusions, where you have a lot of choice rules, especially when there's going to try to be a correction to some of the actions. So the Goldwater-Nichols Act added a lot of choice rules, especially for the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The thing to note here is the absence of payoff rules and scope rules, or the near absence. And I'm going to talk about that in a second here, and why I think that's important. And here's just another way of visualizing it for totals. So you can see choice rules takes up a big chunk of the 163 rule types. And that makes sense, since it is a default rule and it is linked to actions. Scope rules are also considered kind of a catch-all type of rule, but I'm going to tell you why I think that it's important that why the absence of those are important for what I'm looking at here. So looking at default conditions that come from both, as it probably comes from before Gardner and Ostrom in 1991, but is repeated in Ostrom in 2005. This idea of if you don't have certain rule types, you go into a default condition. So when I think of scope rules and payoff rules and the absence of those or near absence, it tells me a few things. And I'm going to relate this to the national security construct in a second here. So default payoff conditions, any player can retain any outcome that the player can physically obtain and defend. And then default scope condition, each player can affect any state of the world as physically possible. So when I'm looking and trying to answer or ask why there's so many, where there are multiple strategies coming out of decision-making constructs where there should be one strategy or at least a couple coordinated strategies, some of this tells me a few things, especially about the formal decision-making networks at the top. But what I wanted to kind of discuss here too is this, this near absence, what it can mean for the outcome. Sorry, I'm gonna move that here. So it could mean that the outcomes for each action situations could overlap or contradict outcomes from other action situations. So lack of scope rules could also point to an absence of measurements of success, no measurable outcomes of the decision-making process. And this is out of the Afghanistan papers too, is one of the, ideas that there is no kind of clear objective, no clear understanding of the strategy or how it was measured as a successful strategy. And looking at, again, Carter et al. In 2016, and in Ostrom 2005, note that scope rules are now becoming more in play when trying to look at measurements of success or measurements of objectives. The one thing I'm not quite in agreement with Carter in is that they mentioned that no scope rules reduces the potential for conflicting objectives and the need for policy actors to balance divergent scope rules. So to me, that's kind of saying the opposite of what is in my mind, is thinking it should coordinate and not conflict objectives if you have more scope rules. So that's just something I'm looking at, and I'm going to try to discombobulate from my mind here. But to me, it's if you don't have a set of objectives that a decision-making construct is going to put out, then you're going to have multiple objectives or no boundary on what can come out of, whether it's the Joint Chiefs of Staff decision-making process or the National Security Council. Payoff rules is a little bit different. I know I had one in there. That payoff rule is for basically for compensating the National Security Advisor with money for a salary, right? So it's not necessarily what I think of when I think of the diagram that's talking about benefits, costs, and benefits of making a certain outcome, potential outcome. So what it also tells me is that it enables an organization to pursue its own desired outcomes without penalty, or so without sanction. So if one of the subordinate decision-making constructs comes out with an objective or a decision that is counter to another, especially a higher node, then it doesn't mean that they're going to be penalized for it. There's no cost to them if they do decide to diverge. Looking at the polycentric arrangement of this is where I'm going to go to next, with looking at the combatant commands, which are these independent military headquarters, or semi-independent, I should say. So there's a headquarters that's in charge of operations in Africa Command, South Command, and for South America, Central Command for the Middle East. And all these commands are basically their own little militaries. They're assigned, different elements of the different services, but they have become more important in some sense than the ambassadors in some of the countries in these regions, because they have a lot of resources, they have a lot of sway. And with regards to their autonomy with decision-making, they come up with their own strategies for their own regions, present this to Congress and to the Secretary of Defense, but they come up with their own. They're called posture statements. So these are things I'm going to be looking at in the future at the collective choice level. So what I'm looking at now, I consider the constitution choice level versus the collective choice, and then further down the operational levels. which I'm going to get to in my dissertation. So my next steps in research here, analysis of these diverse agencies under the main construct, under the formal decision-making constructs. So the combatant commands, the armed services themselves, the embassies. So I'm not just looking at, when I say the national security construct, I don't just mean DOD or the military. The State Department has a big part to play in these decisions, especially when I'm going to look at further, which is point 2, which is security assistance. So I'm going to narrow it down to looking at security assistance. So you can think of training the Afghan military, training the Iraqi military, providing training and education and arms to partner nations that are looking at counterterrorism. So that's security assistance. One small thing that includes this, it's called a dual key program because it's State Department and DOD run. So it has to be, both of them have to agree on this, on the policy. Both of them have to agree on what they provide, which partner or region, the resources. So it's an interesting case to look at. And I'm looking at a case study of the counterterrorism campaign in the Sahel region of Africa. So the areas of Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, that area. So that's been a specific program. So I'm going to use that as my case study and look at this. I have field work planned for Washington, D.C. this summer, where I'm going to do interviews. And this research is to uncover the informal decision-making network. So what I just pulled out as far as rule types in the formal construct, there's nothing really designated in those national security strategy or national security documents or legislation that talks about these lower levels of bureaucracy. So the interviews I hope to pull out, these informal decision-making, I guess you can call them action situations. So if there's something that happens, at least in my experience in the interagency, we have informal working groups that take players from different agencies to solve a specific problem. And that's exactly what the definition of polycentricity kind of implies, is that it allows for ad hoc networks or ad hoc action situations to pop up. So this is what I hope to find from my interviews. I could talk about that in Q&A if you'd like. And then to kind of close up here, what I'm doing in the long run here, the long run of this research is comparing these long-term bureaucratic decision-making processes versus the short-term crisis decision-making. So in one I see as polycentric. It's in the bureaucracy. It's different networks and different action situations, ad hoc, pop up to address certain problems that are not brought up to the highest level, which results in maybe disparate objectives or directions that or strategies really. But also comparing them to the crisis hierarchical ones. So whenever there's a crisis, whenever there's let's say a terrorist attack on a U.S. embassy somewhere, there's going to be a crisis kind of decision-making process. It's more following that formal hierarchical process, short term. And here's where this is coming from, my ideas for my case study. And this is my last slide. I know I'm taking a lot of time, but what I'm going to look at in Mali too is which has been a long-term counterterrorism program that the U.S. is involved with down there from 2006. But there have been spikes where there have been crises. So there was a coup in 2013 and then a coup again in 2020. So during my interviews, I'd like to pull out some of this information, how decisions were made prior to that, and then during that short period of the coup and the aftermath of the coup, and then settling back down into informal kind of bureaucratic decision-making again until the next crisis. And I kind of think of this, I put this brain scan analogy up here because I think of this when I kind of form up these networks, informal versus formal, long-term versus short-term. I think of it as like brain scans when they're looking at different things, like in this example, seeing words versus hearing words, different parts of the brain activate, different neural networks activate. I see the decision-making construct within the national security decision-making construct the same way. So if you have these short, spurts of crisis, one part of that brain is going to activate. That's that formal decision-making action situations at the National Security Council, Joint Chiefs of Staff, DOD, and State Department, which will come later. But then when there's no crisis, when it's just the kind of a day-to-day, month-to-month activity, that's taken over by the bureaucratic informal networks that form up to take care of specific problems. So with that, sorry about some technical difficulties at the beginning. So my slides froze up on me, so I couldn't see what I was talking about. So I can go back and talk about my overarching questions again if you need me to go back to there. And it looks like my slideshow is working again, but I'll end it here, and I look forward to questions and especially comments. Like I was saying it before this started, I have a lot of challenges ahead of me, so I can learn. I hope to learn a lot from people who have already done networking action situations and coding of interviews, institutional grammar, using institutional grammar to code interviews as institutional statements. So those are the couple of challenges I'm facing in the next 6 months or so. So I look forward to any questions you have or comments.
Thanks, Dan. Excellent presentation. So we're opening the floor to questions and answers. Anybody want to go first?
I guess I'll just start by saying I'm so glad to see an international relations scholar utilizing these tools. I think it's fantastic. Right? I mean, I was studying at IU when Mike McGinnis was there, so I'm sure he has more things to say, but I was just really happy to see the application to international relations, because in my own department of political science, the IR people aren't interested at all. So I'm just happy to see it.
Oh, thanks. And I was kind of fortunate to be at University of Arizona, where we have the public policy and the political science departments meshed together. And it gave me the opportunity to see especially IAD framework, how that and institutional grammar just is a perfect fit for what I was trying to look at. And IR and comparatives too, but really delving into the nitty gritty of decision making, I think is one of the things that haven't necessarily been done, like in IR, and I think that's important, and so that I'm having fun doing it. But thank you for that.
Michael? Thanks, Brenda, for giving me an opportunity to jump in here, and thanks, Dan, for a very interesting effort to sort of take this IED work and institutional grammar work into the foreign policy and defense policy sphere. And I kind of have to say I'm a little nostalgic. If I had known all the stuff I knew about institutional grammar, which hadn't been invented yet when I was doing my dissertation, this might have been where I ended up, because my dissertation was on the Cold War, and which ended only a couple of years after I got out, and so I had to come up with some other stuff to study, so I never got back to it. So I'm really glad to see you sort of doing this. Couple suggestions though, and I'm glad you're sort of early on this. I like the way you're starting with the organizational structure based on the 47 and 68 major pieces of legislation, which really defined the whole national security structure of U.S. decision-making policy. But I also like that you're moving then later into looking at things like training and security assistance, because that's a little more operational kind of process. And I think you're going to be able to see it a little better. I mean, I tried to teach some of that stuff. I taught a course undergraduate course in the intelligence community, which is kind of an oxymoron, but not much of not community sense there within the intelligence community. But I really had trouble getting the students interested in the structures of the organizations, the 16 or 17, whatever it is now, different organizations that are involved. But I think it's more interesting to look at sort of the processes that you're going through. And I'd like to encourage you to look to look at the training and security systems, because I think that's good. It's also something we don't do very well. In this, I don't know much about the program in Mali, but except to know that it hasn't been a disaster yet. But we also haven't been as involved in there as much as France has. So if it does become a disaster, it's probably their fault. But I encourage you, if possible, you may not be able to do this, to get even more operational and get down to the level of how information is gathered and processed during counterintelligence campaigns. And I think that you'll find some interesting rules divvying up the responsibility for, who's has access to what intelligence sources, which organization is going to actually make the decision what are the rules to make a decision whether to launch a drone strike or not, and then is it going to be done by the Air Force or by the CIA Zone Air Force, and then who's going to be evaluating the consequences of that afterwards. I mean, I think that kind of sequence would be a very interesting place to look at sort of the policy cycle, the linking of action situations, because you have an incredible number of organizations involved there, and the rules are going to be hard to get to, and you may not be able to without really top secret sort of clearance. So this is something you may want to do afterwards once you get a job where you can have, get your security clearance up to a little bit and sort of get into that. But thinking in terms of evaluation, operational choice, and then the actual implementation, and then the evaluation is, I think, going to give you a lot more interesting things to look at, because there are multiple streams, different organizations doing different things at different places and in different programs. And I know there's been a lot of controversy over the extent to which the intelligence services, like the CIA, is both providing information and delivering services. And then the same problem with the Air Force or the Army intelligence or the joint intelligence sort of services, the DIA services. And there's a reason why, as you said, we have multiple sort of channels and all of that. But I just am curious to see whether you envision getting far enough down the operational level to even consider thinking about that kind of level of application to your very fascinating sort of work.
Thank you, Dr. McGinnis. I definitely am going to look at the operation. So I mentioned my field work is going to be in Washington, D.C., but the other part of that field work is going to be in Stuttgart, Germany at AFRICOM, which is still, I would say, still kind of at the collective choice level. But I also want to do some, it'll probably be phone interviews, but with embassy teams within the country. But at AFRICOM, you have those operators that are doing the training and work and the set coming back and forth. So I definitely had them in my sites for interviews. So when I selected my interviews, I had them at each of those levels to look at for that program, it's called the Trans-Sahara Counterterrorism Partnership. So big, I don't know if they call it that anymore, but it was a big acronym. But so looking at the operational level via going to AFRICOM itself and talking to those who have been involved, not only with planning at that level, at the combatant command level, but also those who have been on the ground and are doing what, carrying out the strategies that were meant to, or the objectives that are supposed to be coming out of Washington. I don't know if the whole point of this is that they probably don't, they kind of diverge from those objectives a bit. So yes, the short answer to your question is I do plan on going to the operational level as part of this, because I do agree with you. That's where the interesting informal stuff informal networking is going to come in. And I do, I do worry about making it general enough to where I don't have to go into a classified realm. So constructing my interview questions to a point where they're generalistic, because I can't really get into, if I go into detail, then they're not going to be able to answer, and then I'm kind of stuck. So thank you very much for the comments. I appreciate it.
Just a quick follow-up, if I could. That's good, and I think that you're doing in AFCOM, that makes a lot of sense. But the more you can sneak in questions about, who's really making these decisions, if we're going to launch a strike, or we're coordinating with these other sort of actors, who's deciding whether this particular case is okay to launch a drone over this, even though there's the terrorists are in the area of a school, or the prime target is in a public area. Sort of who's making those decisions without getting into specific examples of what's actually going to happen, because that's where you're really going to get into sort of secrecy. But my guess is there's going to be a lot of divergence between what's actually happening there and what the rules that supposedly set up in DC were, especially if it's a internationally coordinated sort of process. It's going to get even more complex. But the more you can kind of sneak into those operational details, the better off. And I just think it's just great. I really encourage you to move forward in this. I think it will be a real original contribution to this whole research literature. So you're off to a great start.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Saba? Oh, sorry.
Evan can go first.
You
Okay.
can go, Saba.
Oh, okay.
Go ahead.
Okay. Thanks, Evan. Well, actually, my questions are different, but not unlike, completely unlike Mike's, because one of the things I was wondering as you were presenting is like, what, I guess to this point, like how much of the decision making is actually governed by this, and are there a different set of rules that govern what actually happens in these situations, and that they're deliberately not indicated here because it is like a security thing, or there's some, there's some intent to keep certain channels of communication or decision making private. And so Mike's comments make me think, well, maybe that is true, and that that's not written down, it is come through. So, or the informal, the institutions in use. I mean, if that is the case, then how can we think about what is the role of these? Like, if it's not maybe actually to structure decision making in an operational way, like what is the functional role of these, and then how to make sense of the patterns in the institutional design based on that. Does that make sense? So like, I'll say it a different way. Like, is it your expectation that these are the complete array of rules that govern operational decision making in these environments? How much of that is assumed to be sort of communicated in use for whatever reason? And if there is an expected discrepancy, then what is the functional role of the institutions inform in this case?
Yeah, so I understand, and it's a really good question, because mapping out these action situations at the National Security Council, Joint Chiefs of Staff, those are not going to tell me a lot other than really how like broader strategies or national objectives are put out. And I do not expect, because there are a lot between the National Security Act of 1947 and the Goldwater-Nichols Act. There are internal regulations and guidance on how to I don't want to say make decisions, but how to move information, how to undertake some of these objectives that come out. So, for example, before I do my field work, there are unclassified joint interagency working kind of regulation. I wouldn't say regulations, but guidance. So I plan to pull some institutional statements out of there, because there are deontics that say you must do this or shall, and those will give me more kind of indication, especially within the interagency. Again, this is in Washington, how those organizations below the bigger decision-making groups interact with each other, and how they're supposed to both make decisions and pass information up and down. And then going into, say, the combatant command, Africa Command, they have their own set of rules and kind of internal regulations. Again, some classified, some not. That's going to be a big challenge, because even if they're classified as for official use only, that might cause a problem. But I don't know if this is answering your question, but I just wanted to kind of clarify that there are a lot of other documents and other kind of formal rules and form that are below these legislative acts. So these legislative acts are just kind of coordinating the executive level departments and how they act. But there's lower level guidance and instruction that informs these bureaucratic at the, say, the collective choice level of how they interact. But not much. I mean, again, I was in the joint staff, and I, do remember seeing some manuals go back and forth, but they weren't really used. So we used different processes for contacting other agencies and putting together working groups. Those weren't in like the formal documentation. And does that answer? I think I was kind of rambling there.
Yeah, no, it does. It does. I'm just trying to contextualize kind of this particular institution and form within the context, which I know nothing about in security policy, but yeah.
But so these, like these upper level, higher level decision-making organizations really were designed for more for just coordinating action between all these massive executive departments, and making sure that like what happened in World War II and really post that the Department of the Air Force, say the Army, was not competing with the Department of Navy for strategy in World War II like they did. And that they were put under one roof under the Department of Defense. And then further on that the combatant commands had more under the National Security Act of 1986, the combatant commands now have more autonomy, because they're kind of, their hands were tied by some parochial interests of the service chiefs at the top, and were unable to coordinate action between the services at the operational and tactical level, which led to some of these failures, like the hostage rescue attempt was one of those highlighted examples. But so the combatant commands were given more a direct line of communication to these upper level decision making. So they kind of bypass the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and they go directly to the civilian Secretary of Defense with their role. So it's an interesting, again, I think I went off topic of what your question was, but the higher level decision making ones are the rules and form. They're not going to be able to handle, and they weren't meant to handle every single decision that's made in conflict, especially in counterinsurgencies. But I have yet to see any analysis of how decisions are really formulated in these long-term conflicts. So that's why I'm kind of looking into like you said, kind of this middle level, bureaucratic level decision-making, and how they can be kind of go off in different directions without ever needing to, by the rules, inform the National Security Council what they're, how they're making decisions or going forward, especially with security assistance, because that's why I kind of focused on that as well, because there's a lot of different agencies involved, and it doesn't go to those levels of action situation. These are kind of ad hoc action situations as I saw them.
Thank you.
Thanks. I was
Evan?
sorry for the long-winded act.
This is
Evan, you're on mute.
absolutely fascinating. Look forward to reading what you write up. I was struck by, you mentioned you had found that there were very few scope rules formally. I was wondering, as you start to uncover the informal networks, do you think that scope rules will be fleshed out, that you'll see what we don't see at the constitutional level? And do you think that as you go down to the collective choice, operational, you'll start to see these boundaries of scope that help with not having conflicting kind of agendas.
Yeah, great question. Thank you, Evan. And I expect, whether I'll find it or not, what I expect to see is a lack of scope rules at that collective choice kind of level, but more down in the operational level where there has to be, and, not everything fits perfectly with public policy kind of speak, but down at the operational level of, say, a counterterrorism operation or campaign, there are things like rules of engagement, which tell you, what you can and can't do as far as, you can't, you can you can attack a certain target, but not another, things like that. That's at the very lowest, low level. But even a little bit higher in the operational level is, decision-making, like you can't make decisions without speaking to, say, the embassy team, the chief of the embassy team, so the ambassador, so who's involved in decision-making. So that's not necessarily scope rules. Obviously, that's more position and voice, but I do expect to see a lot more scope rules at the operational level, and not necessarily as much in the collective choice, but more than at the constitution choice level. So I do expect to see more, and I expect to see them increase at the lowest levels, but not at the middle and higher levels of that. So we'll see what happens. It may or may not be there, but like I said, at the very tactical, very low level, there are very much constraints on your outcomes of both decisions and actions.
Does that answer your question, Evan? Okay. I'm going to call on myself real quick just to follow up on this scope rule conversation, because I think it's really interesting. To me, scope rules are like define outcomes, right? So they're in the context of my work, they are less specific in what parties in international conservation treaties are supposed to do, and so I find that I actually think it makes sense to me, not knowing your context, but just looking at the military, that scope rules would be fewer in these documents, because in military situations, you don't want to rely on people having different conceptualizations of outcomes, right? You want to be more specific as to what the desired, what direction military engagement should be taking, I'm assuming. So when you look at scope rules at outcomes, it would be something that I wouldn't expect to see a lot of in these documents. And maybe that's just the way that I conceptualize scope rules through my work, but I just wanted to see what your perception is of that, or if that in any way helps.
Yeah, it does help. And I've been thinking about this last few days. I kind of been running through this, like what would a scope, I do this kind of this thought experiment of what would a scope rule look like within this legislation, so there's just like to paraphrase some of these, that the chairman, I think it's either the chairman or the secretary of defense must provide an annual report to the President and Secretary of Defense on strategy and logistical plans. So there's no scope rule on that, but if you change that to read, we'll provide an annual strategic and logistic plan for forces that does not or is under fulfills the national security objectives as laid out in the national security strategy. So to me, that's kind of bounding what outcomes those strategic and logistical plans could have, but they don't do that. I mean, they leave it open. But that's when I've been thinking about what would they actually look like, and I think they could put scope rules in there to correct this uncoordinated strategic, decision making. So, and again, that's just a hypothetical, but I do agree that I wouldn't expect too many, because like I said, you don't want to constrain decision. You don't want to constrain the innovation or how different levels go about a problem or go about creating strategic plans or logistical plans. You don't want to put too many boundaries on those outcomes so that they could be, innovative or do what they need to do with what they have. So I think I started off, maybe I didn't start off because my stuff froze up and I was trying to fix it. But the military decision or the national security making decision construct is supposed to be decentralized in a sense. So yeah, I think you're right in that maybe I wouldn't expect as many scope rules up there, but I didn't expect to see so few. So to include a big, goose egg in a lot of them.
Yeah.
So that, and also payoff rules, I'm kind of curious about, because the one scope rule or payoff rule I have is about monetary compensation for being the national security advisor. And that's not really, to me, what payoff rules are really. If I translate them to national security policy, I don't really translate them that way, but so I want to look into that, because I think there are sanctions and benefits to certain outcomes of decision making units as more based on receiving resources, not, I want to say praise, but a lot of these groups go want to make a name for themselves and want to say, I want this to be my job or my responsibility. I'm thinking of like the Air Force and Army when they kind of split up. But also different organizations want to highlight themselves as important organizations. And so if they come out with an outcome that's used, they kind of get reciprocal, okay, now you can be into the loop type of thing. So there's other types of payoffs and that I'm thinking of other than, excuse me, monetary or fines or things like that are kind of within the public policy realm, but just as relevant.
I would also look at aggregation rules, because you're talking a lot about coordination. So I'd expect to see a lot of aggregation rules, which will also help with the networking aspect.
Yeah.
Anyways, any other questions, comments for Dan? Michael.
Yeah, just to follow up on that discussion on different types of rules. I think it's important to remember that what you've got here are organizations that are all very hierarchical in their internal structure. And there's many of them interacting, but they're all kind of hierarchical. And for all of them, whether it's the military or the intelligence or even the State Department folks, there's a big focus on who gets to make the decision or who has to make the decision.
Right.
And so often the ultimate outcome of a lot of these rules that you're talking about is the point decision, or you can't make this decision. And so I think that that's a lot of where that sort of the scope or the outcome really comes from. And then if you do get at the operational level, the scope rules are kind of, or the payoff rules are kind of hard to sort of define, because in a military operation, neither military makes the final decision. I mean, you make a decision and then the interaction between the decision the other side made and then whether the drones work or not or stuff like that. So you're kind of not at the end where the outcome's really coming yet in most of the kind of rules that you're looking at. You're not modeling the operation as whether it's successful or not. You're really focusing on what are the rules that determine who has to make what decision under what circumstances and who do they have to contact and stuff like that. So it's a strange kind of a focus. You're kind of far removed from anything that would really be as an outcome. So
yeah,
just an idea.
Yeah, that's a good point. I've been thinking about that. I appreciate everyone who has to peel off. Sorry, and thanks for attending what's peeling off. But this is an interesting discussion, because I had thought about, what are the outcomes at this level? What do I think of outcomes when I think of the National Security Council, Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the upper office of the Department of Defense, maybe OSD. So the outcomes to me are hard to pin down because they're decisions. They're decisions that are kind of unknown. It doesn't say specifically in this legislation that the outcome of this is a decision about X or Y or Z. And then that's where I think of the scope rules. How do you evaluate that decision? So yeah, it's hard. I expect to see more outcome-based, very concrete outcomes at the lower levels of analysis of this. When I do my IG analysis of this IG 2.0 of the institutional statements, I do try to pick out the different aims to kind of figure out if an outcome is actually a decision or is an outcome passing information. That's where I see the most. It's either going to be, you're going to make this decision, or the outcome of this is going to be pass up information to this other situation, and they chew it over or approve it. But yeah, outcomes are very seldomly explicit in these documents, so it's very difficult. So I've just been looking at information passed or decisions made, and it's very nebulous. But it's interesting. I do think there's outcomes there, but they're just kind of nebulous and hard to pin down.
Yeah. Great. Thank you very
Thanks.
much for the excellent presentation, Dan. And this concludes our December workshop. We will see you again January 3rd for the next one in 2023. So happy holidays to everybody. And thank you, Dan, again.
Thank you, Uta. Appreciate it. Thanks, everyone.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.